Welcome to the Anthropology collections at Cornell University. My name is Frederic Gleach, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce to you the collections. The Anthropology collections at Cornell date to the founding of the university, and in fact, the building in which we sit was originally constructed as the University Museum. A.D. White and Ezra Cornell realized that if they had any hope of fulfilling their vision of any person, any subject, here in central New York, away from the resources of a major urban center, that they had to get the materials in for the students and faculty to work with right from the start. And so for years, even before the university opened, the original faculty were traveling the world, seeking donations, doing research and collecting materials that would come back to Ithaca to be housed in the University Museum. Of course, as the university grew, the collections grew, the space needs changed, and so if you walk into McGraw Hall today, it doesn't look much like a museum. And this space, the Anthropology collections, is the last bit that preserves that. The rest of the building is broken up into offices, classrooms, and so forth. The Anthropology collections today include somewhere around 20,000 pieces, about evenly divided between ethnographic and archaeological materials. But some of these collections date back to that original period in the university. For example, the original Cornell geologist, Charles Fred Hart, did some of the first archaeological work in the Amazon. He also collected some ethnographic data from the indigenous people that he met there. And we have here in the collections artifacts from his archaeological work in 1869 to 1871, particularly from Marijo Island, but some other locations in the Amazon as well. A.D. White recognized that there was important and very interesting archaeological work that was being done at the time of the founding of Cornell. And so even though archaeology wasn't really a part of the core teaching program, except for classics, of course, he purchased for the University Museum several collections, including, for example, a collection of Mississippian ceramics, another collection of Danish Neolithic tools, so those materials, many of those pieces, are still in the collections today. After the early years of the University Museum, for a variety of reasons, there was not a lot of activity with anthropological, archaeological materials in the museum collections up until the late 1930s, early 1940s. In 1937, Lauriston Sharpe was hired as the first anthropologist in a regular permanent position here at Cornell. And in the 1940s, he began to expand the anthropology program here at Cornell, with a number of faculty hires being brought in. But he recognized that even though archaeology wasn't a core part of the program here, that it would nevertheless be useful to have some good materials in for teaching. And so at that time, he began work and worked with students to get the collections reorganized, recatalogued, updated, and arranged some donations from other institutions to fill gaps that were in the collections that he thought might be useful for teaching purposes. So for specific example, some of the European Paleolithic materials we have were donated in exchange at that time and come into the collections. We have today somewhere around 20,000 pieces, as I say, and it is primarily a teaching collection. I usually say that we have examples of just about anything that one might want to have an example of for teaching purposes. If we don't have an example of it, we probably have something close enough, or maybe I know somebody who has one, that we can get one in to use with classes. We work with the collections primarily in two different ways. One is to lend objects out to faculty for use in classes. Things like stone tools are particularly amenable to that because they're not very fragile and they're not going to hurt anybody really. But the main way that we work with the materials in the collections is by bringing groups of students, either classes or independent groups, in to look at objects that I will lay out on the tables in the collections for the particular purpose at hand. And given the breadth of the collections, we can focus on a lot of different sorts of things. Very often I do a sort of a world culture survey kind of thing that will range from the lower Paleolithic through the Bronze Age in Old World prehistory, may or may not then include some New World materials as well, and then ethnographic materials from whatever particular area is likely to fit best with the focus of that class and that particular group. We have some interesting materials that came in more recent years. We don't have a budget to acquire materials, so there aren't purchases after the early years of the museum. But there are materials that come in through both faculty research and donations by alumni and others. So, for example, we have a very strong collection of materials from the Philippines collected in the early 20th century, probably by a mix of military and missionary personnel who were working there during that period. We have Lauriston Sharpe's Uriarant materials from the work that he did in the 1930s that famously produced the article Steel Axes for Stone Age Australians. And we do have one of the stone axes that the Uriarant were using at that time as well as part of that collection. We have also a collection of Hmong clothing that Lauriston Sharpe and his wife Ruth donated to the collections. We have, as you see lurking over my shoulders here, the Ndembu masks that were collected by Victor Turner in the late 1950s and donated to the collections here in the 1960s. These are among my favorite materials in the collections, which is why I've got them in the background for us today. We have just an incredibly wide range of materials that can be done in different ways. Class presentations, aside from the sort of general survey that I was just talking about, sometimes we will focus on a particular technology or function. So foodways is a very common one. And I often again start that with the lower Paleolithic and talk about Oldowan choppers and transitions to the Acheulean and ways that choppers might have been used, breaking open bones, for example. Then we talk about hunting, foraging, gathering, horticultural and agricultural developments, the changes that come in at the Neolithic, and then again go into more recent, more contemporary sorts of things. We also happen to have in the collections, somewhat unusually for anthropological collections, a variety of materials from ancient Egypt. Cornell received a donation from the Egyptian Expeditionary Force in the early 20th century, primarily from the site of Abydos. And so we can put out a variety of Egyptian materials, perhaps most interestingly, most frequently in recent years, including a beer fermentation jar and a bread mold, a heavy ceramic vessel that was used for baking bread before the ovens were developed. I tend to take an approach in the collections that is narrative forward, that is focused on storytelling. And so I try to sit down with the faculty or with the students and figure out what their interests are, what they most want to get out of their visit from the collections, and then think about the stories that relate to that and how those can be represented through objects and artifacts that we have in the collections. Another strength of the collections is pre-Columbian Peru. We have extensive collections of both ceramics and textiles from that area representing a number of different cultural traditions. And so that is an area that we can illustrate a wide variety of different sorts of things and use the materials for other kinds of setups too. The main thing about the anthropology collections here at Cornell, a thing that I try to keep front and center in all of my thinking about ways we can work with classes, with students, with faculty, with the objects, is the experience of the collections. Because people can get closer to the objects here, because many objects can be picked up and handled even, particularly things like stone tools. Students can get a different kind of experience here than they've had or will have in most kinds of collections. And as somebody who really believes in learning with objects, in thinking with things, this is a kind of experience that's very important to me to be able to convey. This is primarily a teaching collection, but there are areas in which research is a real viable possibility, particularly research for undergraduate students, although we have had a couple of master's theses written out of the collections as well. Many of the materials in the collections represent things that are fairly well known, and so there's already a good deal of literature out there, and it's not going to be terribly productive for primary scholarly research by professionals in the field. But of course, undergraduate students haven't done that research yet, and even if somebody else might have done some of it, it's going to be new to them. And so it's really useful to have these kinds of collections that students can come in and do research projects on, get the experience of doing research, working with materials, thinking through problems, working with material culture, and be able to come up with creative ways to analyze, think about, write about, and otherwise present the materials in different kinds of ways that fit their own interests and needs as students. And that's what the anthropology collections are all about, is filling needs for our students that aren't going to be met anywhere else. This is really a unique resource, and I always encourage people to make extensive use of it, and I'm here to facilitate that as much as possible.